The store was quiet until a rich, angry man walked in. He wanted his money back for a tent he had broken himself. The store manager, a brave black woman named Naomi, calmly said no. This made the man furious. He hated that she was the boss. His anger quickly turned dangerous. He grabbed a heavy metal stove from the counter and raised it high, ready to throw it right at her face. But the angry man made a huge mistake. He did not know who was watching from the next aisle. A quiet Navy SEAL and his highly trained K9 dog were standing in the shadows, and they were about to teach him a brutal lesson. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. Denver, Colorado sat under a crisp, cloudless sky, the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains framing the horizon. Inside Altitude Tactical Supply, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the bright morning outside. This was not a standard sporting goods store. It was a sprawling, high-end haven for extreme outdoor enthusiasts, professional mountaineers, and private security contractors. The massive interior featured polished concrete floors, matte black steel shelving, and dramatic spotlighting that highlighted gear costing more than most people's monthly rent. Mannequins fully kitted in tactical vests, snow camouflage, and advanced survival harnesses stood like silent sentinels near the entrance. Every display was meticulously arranged to project an aura of elite readiness and uncompromising quality. Naomi stood behind the main checkout counter, scanning the morning sales figures on her tablet. She was a striking black woman in her early 30s, with a strong, athletic build that hinted at years of rigorous physical training. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, tight bun, and her sharp, observant eyes missed nothing that happened on the sales floor. She wore the signature charcoal polo shirt of the management team, a garment she wore with immense pride. This position had not been handed to her freely. Naomi had spent 5 long years climbing the corporate ladder within the company. She remembered the early days, working grueling double shifts, auditing the massive warehouse alone in the freezing cold, and enduring the constant pressure to be flawless, just to be considered adequate. She had faced subtle biases and blatant dismissals from wealthy customers who took one look at her and assumed she knew nothing about high-altitude survival gear or tactical ballistics. Yet, she had persevered. She studied every complex equipment manual, mastered every product specification, and outworked everyone around her until the regional board of directors had no choice but to promote her to general manager. Today, the store hummed with a quiet, expensive energy. A few affluent customers quietly browsed the racks of thermal optics and insulated survival wear. Naomi was just about to close out her inventory report when the heavy glass front doors slid open with an aggressive, loud hiss. A man stormed into the store. He was in his mid-50s, white, with a face flushed tight with irritation. He had thinning silver hair swept back meticulously and wore a tailored navy sports coat over a crisp white button-down shirt. His expensive leather loafers clicked sharply against the concrete floor, broadcasting a sense of absolute entitlement. Over his shoulder, he dragged a large, heavy nylon duffel bag. The bag scraped along the floor, slightly scuffing the polished concrete, a detail he clearly did not care about. His aggressive presence disrupted the quiet, sophisticated atmosphere of the store immediately. He did not browse. He marched directly toward the main counter, bypassing the standard velvet rope line, and slammed the heavy bag onto the polished wood surface. The loud thud echoed through the front section of the store, causing a few nearby customers to turn their heads in surprise. "I need a manager," the man barked, slapping his hand flat on the counter. "Right now." Naomi set her tablet aside and stood perfectly straight. She offered a polite, practiced smile. "I am the general manager on duty. My name is Naomi. How can I help you today, sir?" The man looked her up and down. His eyes narrowed slightly, betraying a flicker of doubt, as if he expected someone entirely different to be in charge of such a prestigious establishment. "You are the manager?" he asked, his tone dripping with obvious skepticism. "Yes, sir," Naomi replied evenly, keeping her voice completely calm and professional. "What seems to be the issue?" The man scoffed, unzipping the duffel bag with aggressive, jerky movements. "My name is Richard. I bought this piece of garbage from your store 3 days ago. The salesman told me it was the best expedition tent on the market. It is supposed to withstand extreme weather conditions. I took it up to the Rockies this weekend, and the thing tore right down the middle on the very first night. It ruined my entire hunting trip." He reached into the bag and violently pulled out a massive heap of dark green fabric. Naomi recognized it immediately. It was the Apex Summit Series, an extreme altitude tent that retailed for nearly $2,000. It was engineered with advanced ripstop materials and reinforced seams, specifically designed to handle hurricane-force winds and jagged, unforgiving terrain. "I want a full refund to my credit card," Richard demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "And I want it processed immediately." Naomi maintained her professional composure. "I am very sorry to hear that your trip was interrupted, Richard. Let me take a look at the damage first. Our Apex series is incredibly durable, so a critical tear is highly unusual. If it is a manufacturer defect, I will absolutely process your return." She pulled the heavy fabric toward her and began spreading it across the wide counter. She traced her fingers along the reinforced seams, checking the tension points and the waterproof inner lining. The material was pristine, showing no signs of factory weakness. Then she found the real issue. Right in the center of the side panel, there was a jagged, ugly tear. The edges of the rip were blackened, stiff, and melted. Naomi leaned in closer. She smelled the faint, distinct odor of charred nylon and camp fuel. This was not a stress tear from high winds. This was a burn hole. Someone had set up a portable heating stove far too close to the side wall, melting the synthetic fabric before something sharp, likely a tent pole or a rock, ripped through the weakened, compromised material. Naomi looked up. She met Richard's angry gaze with steady eyes. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She had dealt with customers like him before. They broke expensive equipment out of sheer carelessness and expected the store to blindly absorb the cost of their mistakes. "Sir," Naomi began, keeping her tone respectful but exceptionally firm, "I have inspected the tent. The Apex Summit is fully warranted against any factory defects or seam failures. However, this damage was not caused by a manufacturing flaw." Richard uncrossed his arms, leaning heavily over the counter. His face grew redder. "Excuse me? What exactly are you implying?" "I am not implying anything, sir," Naomi said, pointing clearly to the melted edges of the hole for him to see. "This fabric has been exposed to extreme direct heat. It looks like a camp stove or a lantern was placed directly against the nylon, which caused the material to melt and subsequently tear. Our corporate return policy clearly states that we cannot offer refunds for items damaged by user error or improper handling." Richard stared at her, his mouth falling open slightly in sheer disbelief. He was a wealthy man who was not used to being told no. He was certainly not used to being told no by a young black woman in a retail environment. "Are you calling me a liar?" Richard raised his voice, ensuring the customers in the next aisle could hear him clearly. "Are you standing there, in that little uniform shirt, telling me that I do not know how to set up a damn tent?" "I am simply explaining what the physical evidence shows," Naomi replied, refusing to back down an inch. "The warranty covers defects, not accidental burns. I cannot process a return for this item." Richard slammed his fist on the counter. The heavy thud made the nearby display stands rattle. "Listen to me very carefully," he hissed, his polite veneer completely stripped away. "You are going to take this trash back, you are going to swipe my card, and you are going to give me my $2,000. Do you understand me?" Naomi stood her ground, her expression immovable. "I understand what you are asking, sir, but the answer is no." The silence in Altitude Tactical Supply grew heavy. The ambient outdoor music playing over the speakers suddenly felt entirely out of place. Richard stood frozen for a fraction of a second. The refusal hit him like a physical strike. His face transitioned from a shade of irritated red to a deep, furious crimson. "No?" Richard repeated the word softly at first, tasting it, before his voice escalated into a sharp bark. "You are telling me no?" "That is correct, sir," Naomi said. She kept her hands resting lightly on the counter, visible and non-threatening. "Store policy is absolute on user-inflicted damage." Richard let out a harsh, ugly laugh. He looked around the store, making eye contact with the few customers who had stopped to watch the commotion. He wanted an audience. He needed validation for his anger. "This is unbelievable," Richard announced to the room. He turned his attention back to Naomi, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. The veneer of a frustrated customer vanished, replaced by something much darker and far more personal. "I spend thousands of dollars in this establishment every single year," Richard said, pointing a rigid finger inches from Naomi's face. "And they leave a woman like you in charge? It is an absolute joke. I suppose corporate needed to fill a diversity quota. They needed a black woman at the front desk to look good for their quarterly reports." Naomi felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard variations of this speech before. The words were designed to strip away her hard-earned authority and reduce her to a stereotype. She took a slow, measured breath. She refused to give him the reaction he desperately wanted. "Sir, your comments are inappropriate," Naomi stated. Her voice remained steady, though the effort required to keep it level grew harder by the second. "We can discuss the tent, or we can end this conversation." "We will end it when I say we end it," Richard snapped. He leaned his entire body weight against the glass display case housing expensive GPS watches. The glass creaked under the sudden pressure. "You do not belong in a place like this. Look around you. You do not know the first thing about tactical survival gear. You are out of your depth. And you are too arrogant to admit you made a mistake." Near the front entrance, Marcus, a young college student working the morning shift as a cashier, took a hesitant step forward. Marcus wore the same charcoal management polo, though his hung loosely on his thin frame. He looked terrified. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to defend his manager. But Richard snapped his head in the boy's direction. "Mind your own business, kid," Richard ordered, "unless you want to join her in the unemployment line." Marcus swallowed hard and stepped back, lowering his eyes to the floor. Guilt washed over his face, but the fear of the wealthy, aggressive man kept him rooted to his spot. Naomi caught Marcus's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. She did not need the young man risking his job for her. She could handle this. She always handled this. In the thermal optics aisle, a well-dressed older couple exchanged nervous glances. Instead of intervening or calling for security, they simply set down the binoculars they were holding and hurried out the front doors, eager to escape the uncomfortable situation. Their departure only emboldened Richard. He saw their retreat as a victory, a silent agreement with his behavior. "See that?" Richard sneered, gesturing toward the exiting couple. "You are driving away actual paying customers, people who actually belong here. This is exactly what happens when you give authority to people who have no business holding it." Naomi squared her shoulders. "I am going to ask you to leave the store, Richard, right now. You are causing a disturbance, and I will not tolerate discriminatory language against myself or my staff." "You will not tolerate?" Richard mocked, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. He slammed his hand against the counter again. "You do not have the power to tolerate anything. You are a glorified clerk." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored sports coat and pulled out a sleek silver smartphone. He unlocked the screen with aggressive taps, his movements jerky and erratic. "You made a massive mistake today," Richard said, pointing the phone at her. "I know people at the corporate office. I play golf with Greg Miller, the regional director of this entire Western Division. We are close friends, real friends, not the kind of friends you make." Naomi knew Greg Miller. He was a strict, profit-driven executive who rarely visited the retail locations unless there was a problem. He was demanding, but she had always maintained a professional relationship with him. Hearing Richard use the director's name as a weapon did not shake her, but it signaled that the situation was escalating beyond a simple customer service dispute. "Call him if you feel that is necessary," Naomi replied, her tone icy. "My decision regarding the refund stands." "Oh, I am going to call him," Richard promised, his face twisted into an ugly smile. "I am going to tell him exactly how you treat his top-tier clients. I am going to tell him about your total lack of professionalism and your horrible attitude. I will make sure he knows that keeping a black woman with a chip on her shoulder as a store manager is terrible for his bottom line." He took a step back, holding the phone up as if it were a loaded weapon. "You are done," Richard declared loudly. "Pack up your locker. I will have your badge and your job before the clock strikes noon. You will be lucky if you can find a job sweeping floors after I am finished with you." Naomi did not flinch. She stared directly into his eyes, refusing to be intimidated by his wealth, his connections, or his hateful words. But the air in the store had grown toxic, heavy with the weight of unprovoked malice. The confrontation had reached a boiling point, and the fragile peace of the morning was shattered completely. Far away from the bright lights of the main entrance, the rear of Altitude Tactical Supply felt like a completely different world. The cold weather section was insulated, dimly lit, and remarkably quiet. Here, Blake stood analyzing the stitching on an extreme temperature parka. Blake was 32 years old, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a broad, solid frame built by years of relentless physical conditioning. He wore faded tactical cargo pants, sturdy hiking boots, and a simple olive-drab long-sleeve shirt. His dark brown hair was cut military short, and his piercing hazel eyes scanned the product with practiced efficiency. He was an active-duty Navy SEAL, currently on a mandatory 3-week leave following a grueling overseas deployment. His body was resting in Colorado, but his mind always maintained a quiet, constant state of situational awareness. Sitting perfectly still at Blake's left heel was Shadow. Shadow was a purebred German Shepherd, K9, weighing 85 pounds of pure muscle and focus. His coat was a striking mix of deep black and rich tan. His ears stood at rigid attention. Shadow was not a pet. He was a highly decorated working dog, trained to detect explosives, track hostile targets, and apprehend threats in the most dangerous environments on Earth. Right now, Shadow wore a sleek, black service harness. He did not sniff the merchandise. He did not pull on his short leash. He simply watched his handler, waiting for the next command. The bond between them was forged in fire, relying on subtle body language and silent cues rather than loud verbal commands. A sudden, sharp noise shattered the peace of the back aisles. It was a heavy thud, followed immediately by an aggressive, raised male voice. Blake stopped examining the parka. He did not flinch. His heart rate did not spike. Instead, his mind instantly shifted into assessment mode. He listened to the acoustics of the building. The sound came from the front checkout area. He heard the distinct cadence of a verbal altercation. The male voice was escalating, growing louder and more erratic with every passing second. Blake recognized that tone. It was the sound of someone losing control, someone trying to dominate a space through sheer volume and intimidation. Blake dropped his hand to his side. He snapped his fingers once, producing a sharp, barely audible sound. Shadow immediately stood up. The dog's body tensed, his eyes locking onto Blake with absolute concentration. Blake gave a subtle downward hand signal. It meant, stay close and stay silent. The two of them began to move. They navigated through the aisles of tents, sleeping bags, and climbing gear. Blake walked with the silent, fluid grace of a man who had spent his adult life moving through hostile territory undetected. He stepped lightly, rolling his weight from heel to toe. Shadow mirrored his pace flawlessly. Their footsteps made absolutely no sound against the polished concrete floor. As they moved closer to the front, Blake noticed the shift in the store's atmosphere. A few customers were hurriedly walking in the opposite direction, their faces pale, eager to escape the conflict. Blake ignored them. His focus remained fixed on the source of the disturbance. Blake stopped behind a tall display rack filled with heavy nylon climbing ropes. This position gave him a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the main checkout counter while keeping him partially hidden in the shadows of the tall shelving units. He stood perfectly still and observed the situation unfolding 30 feet away. He saw the angry man in the tailored sports coat. The man was leaning his entire body weight aggressively over the counter. Blake watched him slam his hand down, shaking the glass display cases. Then, the hateful words reached Blake's ears. He heard the racial slurs. He heard the blatant insults directed at the female manager. He heard the man threatening to destroy her career. Blake shifted his gaze to the woman behind the counter. Her name tag read Naomi. She stood tall, refusing to break eye contact with the aggressor. She kept her hands visible and her posture straight. Blake respected her composure instantly. She was holding her ground against a larger, louder opponent. But Blake also recognized the danger she was in. He analyzed the angry man's body language. The man's face was flushed red. His shoulders were tense and raised. His hands were clenching and unclenching into tight fists. He was invading the manager's personal space, trying to force her to retreat. This was no longer just a customer service dispute. It was a targeted, aggressive assault on another human being. Blake had spent his entire military career fighting to protect people he would never even meet. He had seen the worst of humanity in war zones across the globe. He had witnessed cruelty, violence, and the abuse of power in its rawest forms. Coming home to American soil, he expected to leave that darkness behind. Seeing it manifest here, in a bright retail store on a sunny Tuesday morning, disgusted him. The man in the suit was not a combatant, but he was a bully, using his wealth and perceived status as weapons to crush someone who was simply doing her job. Blake despised bullies above all else. He watched Naomi take a slow breath. He admired her strength. She did not raise her voice. She did not match the man's chaotic energy. She remained a pillar of calm. However, Blake knew that calm logic rarely worked on a person who had already surrendered to blind anger. The man in the suit was not listening to reason. He was feeding on his own outrage. Shadow let out a very low, barely perceptible growl deep in his chest. The dog's ears flattened slightly against his skull. He stared intensely at the aggressive man, recognizing him as a direct threat. Blake reached down and placed a firm, reassuring hand on Shadow's broad neck. The dog immediately silenced the growl, respecting the physical touch, but his eyes never wavered from the target. Blake waited in the shadows. He monitored the distance between the angry man and the heavy metal objects sitting on the counter. The tension in the store had peaked. The air felt thick and heavy. Blake knew the breaking point was only seconds away. He stood ready, a silent guardian in the aisles, prepared to step out of the darkness the moment the invisible line was crossed. The words echoed through the spacious retail floor, bouncing off the high ceilings and the rows of heavy equipment. Richard stood there, clutching his phone like a weapon, his chest heaving with arrogant breath. He fully expected Naomi to crumble. He expected tears, apologies, or at the very least, fear. He was a wealthy man who wielded his connections to punish anyone who dared to inconvenience him. He believed that threatening her livelihood would force her to surrender. Naomi did not surrender. She did not cry. She did not even blink. She looked at the angry man standing across from her, and a profound sense of clarity washed over her mind. Naomi remembered her very first job in retail, working at a small sporting goods store 12 years ago. She remembered a shift supervisor who constantly gave her the worst schedules and passed her over for every single promotion. She remembered customers who would walk right past her to ask a white teenage boy for advice on hiking boots, assuming she knew nothing about the outdoors. For years, she had swallowed those insults. She had bitten her tongue, lowered her eyes, and worked twice as hard just to prove she belonged in the room. She had sacrificed her weekends and holidays. She had memorized every technical specification of every product in the catalog. She had earned her position through undeniable merit and relentless dedication. She had fought too hard and climbed too high to let an entitled bully tear her down with cheap threats and racial insults. Naomi straightened her spine. She pulled her shoulders back, lifting her chin slightly. She locked her dark eyes onto Richard. She radiated a quiet, unshakable power. "Are you finished, sir?" Naomi asked. Her voice was perfectly calm. She did not raise her volume to match his shouting. She spoke with the steady rhythm of a professional who was completely in control of the situation. Richard stared at her. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His threat had failed completely. The phone in his hand, his supposed weapon of destruction, suddenly felt useless. Her calm defiance shattered his illusion of absolute power. "You can call whoever you want," Naomi continued, her tone crisp and clear. "You can call the regional director. You can call the corporate office in Seattle. The policy does not change. I will not authorize a return for an item that you destroyed through your own negligence. Your threats will not change the facts, and they certainly will not change my decision." The redness in Richard's face deepened into a dangerous, dark purple. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his tight white collar. He was a man who lived his entire life having doors opened for him. He was used to people rushing to accommodate his every demand. He simply could not process the reality of being denied, especially by a black woman who refused to bow to his status. "You arrogant little." Richard trailed off, stepping closer to the counter. He leaned forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. He slapped his hand flat against the wood surface again, closer to her this time. Naomi did not step back. She held her ground. "I am going to ask you to leave my store," Naomi stated firmly. "Right now. You are causing a public disturbance. You are using discriminatory language against the staff. We will not tolerate this behavior in our establishment." Richard looked around the store. He saw Marcus, the young cashier, watching with wide, terrified eyes from the next register. He saw a few other employees standing frozen near the climbing wall. He realized they were all watching him. He realized he was losing this confrontation publicly. His fragile ego twisted his embarrassment into pure, violent rage. He needed to reassert his dominance. He needed to punish the woman who dared to stand up to him. "Your store?" Richard hissed. Spit flew from his lips, landing on the polished counter. "This is not your store. You do not own anything here. You are just a clerk. You are a nobody. I fund your paycheck. I keep the lights on in this building. People like you should learn their place." "Leave the premises, sir," Naomi ordered, her voice hardening. "If you refuse to walk out those doors right now, I will call security and have them physically remove you." The word security snapped the very last thread of Richard's self-control. The idea of being escorted out of a high-end store like a common criminal was too much for his pride to bear. He let out a harsh, primal grunt of anger. He dropped his expensive smartphone onto the floor. The screen shattered against the concrete, but he did not even look down. He lunged forward. His hands grabbed wildly at the items displayed on the checkout counter. Next to the cash register sat a promotional display of heavy, solid titanium camping stoves. They were dense, industrial-grade metal cylinders designed to withstand extreme mountain conditions, weighing several pounds each. Richard grabbed the nearest titanium stove. He wrapped his large hand tightly around the cold metal base, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. He lifted it high above his head, his face twisted into a mask of pure, uncontrolled fury. His eyes locked onto Naomi, burning with violent intent. He leaned his entire body weight forward, pulling his arm back, preparing to hurl the heavy metal object directly at her head with all the force he could muster. Naomi gasped, her eyes widening as she realized what he was about to do. The sudden escalation from verbal abuse to physical violence caught her off guard. The distance between them was too short. She did not have the time to turn and run. She raised both of her arms instinctively to shield her face, planting her feet firmly behind the register, bracing herself for the crushing impact of the metal. The entire store seemed to plunge into a breathless, terrifying silence as the heavy object hovered in the air, a fraction of a second away from leaving her severely injured. The heavy titanium camping stove caught the bright overhead lights as Richard lifted it high into the air. His muscles coiled tight with violent intent. He aimed the solid metal cylinder directly at Naomi. His face was twisted into an unrecognizable mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was fully committed to the strike. Naomi closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She raised her forearms and locked her elbows together, bracing her body behind the cash register to absorb the crushing impact. The air in the store felt completely static. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. The faint, upbeat acoustic music playing over the store speakers felt bizarrely out of place against the impending violence. Before Richard could thrust his arm forward, a sharp, distinct clicking sound cut through the heavy silence. Blake did not yell. He did not issue a loud verbal command. He simply released the tension on the short tactical leash and signaled his partner. Shadow exploded forward. The German Shepherd did not hesitate for a microsecond. His thick claws found immediate traction on the polished concrete floor. He cleared the 30 feet of open space between the back aisles and the front counter in under 3 seconds. He moved like a guided missile, a terrifying blur of black and tan fur. Shadow hit the front panel of the heavy wooden checkout counter and used his powerful hind legs to propel himself straight up into the air. He landed squarely on the wide counter surface with a heavy, resounding thud. The thick wood shuddered under his 85 pounds of solid muscle. Shadow positioned himself directly between Naomi and the angry customer. A deep, primal roar erupted from Shadow's chest. It was a terrifying sound. It was not a warning bark or a playful yip. It was the guttural, bone-chilling snarl of an apex predator preparing to tear flesh. Shadow bared his teeth, exposing rows of sharp white fangs. His ears flattened tightly against his skull. His dark, intelligent eyes locked onto Richard with absolute, unwavering focus. Richard froze mid-throw. His brain struggled to process the sudden appearance of the massive animal. The human instinct to fear a deadly predator completely overrode his blind anger. Pure, unfiltered terror flooded his veins. His eyes bulged wide. He stared at the dog standing just inches from his face, realizing how close he was to losing his throat. His fingers went completely numb. The heavy titanium stove slipped from his grasp. It struck the thick glass display case below the counter, cracking the pane with a sharp snap before plummeting to the concrete floor with a massive, deafening crash. The metal cylinder rolled across the aisle, finally coming to a stop near a mannequin display. Richard screamed. It was a high, thin sound of pure panic. He threw both hands up to protect his face and stumbled violently backward. His expensive leather loafers offered no grip on the slick floor. He lost his balance completely. He fell hard, his tailbone slamming onto the concrete. His legs kicked out wildly as he scrambled backward like a frightened crab. He pushed himself away from the counter until his back slammed hard against a metal display rack full of heavy hiking socks. The rack wobbled violently, dumping dozens of items onto his head and shoulders. Blake stepped out from the shadows of the climbing gear aisle. He moved with a relaxed, incredibly confident stride. He did not rush. He did not look at the man cowering on the floor. He walked straight toward the checkout counter and looked directly at Naomi. Naomi slowly lowered her arms. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she processed the sudden shift in reality. She was completely unharmed. She looked at the massive, snarling dog standing on her counter, forming a perfect physical shield in front of her. Then, she looked at the tall, quiet man approaching from the aisle. "Are you injured?" Blake asked. His voice was steady, low, and incredibly calm. It was the voice of a man completely at home in chaotic situations. Naomi took a deep breath. She swallowed hard to clear her dry throat and forced her hands to stop trembling. She straightened her posture. "No," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "I am perfectly fine. "Thank you." Blake nodded once. He turned his attention to his dog. "Shadow," Blake said softly. "Guard." The dog immediately stopped snarling. He did not step down from the counter. He remained standing tall and rigid, maintaining his position as a physical barrier. He stopped making noise, but his eyes never left Richard. Shadow looked like a gargoyle carved from dark stone, waiting for a single wrong move. Richard gasped for air on the floor. His tailored navy suit was covered in dust and stray hiking socks. His face was pale and slick with sudden sweat. He looked at the highly trained dog, then at Blake. Slowly, the immediate fear of death began to fade, and his familiar, arrogant outrage clawed its way back to the surface. He felt humiliated. He had been terrified in front of an entire store, bested by a dog and a quiet stranger. Richard grabbed the metal display rack and pulled himself up. His hands shook violently. He pointed a trembling finger at Blake. "You?" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You let that monster attack me. You set a wild animal on a paying customer. I will sue you. I will take everything you own." Blake stood with his hands resting casually at his sides. He did not adopt a fighting stance, but his entire posture radiated extreme danger. He looked at Richard with utter disgust. "He did not attack you," Blake stated flatly, his tone devoid of any emotion. "If he had attacked you, you would not be standing right now. He stopped you." "He tried to kill me!" Richard shrieked. He looked around the store frantically for support. The other customers and employees were frozen in place, watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. Everyone had seen him raise the heavy metal stove. Richard pointed at the young cashier, Marcus, who was standing a few feet away, clutching the store's landline phone to his chest. "Call the police!" Richard commanded the young boy. "Call them right now. Tell them I was brutally assaulted. Tell them this maniac brought a vicious, untrained dog into a public store and tried to have me mauled. I want him arrested immediately." Blake did not move a single inch. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Richard. "That is a great idea," Blake said calmly. "Have them send an officer. Tell them a man just attempted to assault a store manager with a deadly weapon." Richard sneered. He puffed his chest out, trying desperately to regain his lost authority and project power he no longer held. "You think they will believe you? Look at me, and look at her. They will listen to me. I have friends in the local department. I am going to make sure you are locked up in a cell, and I am going to have that beast put down before the sun sets today." Shadow let out another extremely low rumble deep in his throat, reacting to the aggressive tone in Richard's voice. A single, subtle glance from Blake kept the dog perfectly still on the counter. The battle lines were clearly drawn. Outside the heavy glass doors of the store, the faint sound of approaching sirens began to wail in the distance. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, bleeding through the thick glass windows of Altitude Tactical Supply. Inside, the standoff remained frozen. Richard pushed himself up from the floor, his chest heaving. The initial shock of the massive German Shepherd had passed, replaced entirely by a boiling, toxic mixture of humiliation and rage. He had been embarrassed in front of the entire store. He looked at the faces of the customers and employees. They were not looking at him with respect. They were looking at him with pity and disgust. His fragile ego could not handle it. He needed a victim. He needed to prove he was still the most powerful person in the room. Richard looked at Shadow. The dog stood perfectly still on the counter, a silent guardian protecting Naomi. Shadow did not bark. He did not snap. He simply watched Richard with cold, intelligent eyes. To Richard, that calm discipline felt like an insult. He thought the dog was just a trained pet, something he could easily intimidate if he showed enough aggression. "You think a mutt scares me?" Richard sneered, taking a sudden, aggressive step forward. "I will break its jaw." He pulled his right leg back. His expensive leather loafer aimed directly at Shadow's ribs. He intended to kick the dog with every ounce of force he possessed. He never made contact. Blake moved. He did not run. He did not shout a warning. He closed the distance between them with terrifying speed and absolute silence. It was the movement of a man who had spent a decade operating in close-quarters combat. Before Richard could even swing his leg forward, Blake was already there. Blake reached out with his left hand and clamped his fingers around Richard's wrist. His grip was like industrial steel. He twisted Richard's arm outward, applying immediate pressure to the elbow joint. With his right hand, Blake pressed firmly against the back of Richard's shoulder. He used Richard's own forward momentum against him, pivoting smoothly on his heel and driving the angry man face first toward the polished concrete floor. It took less than 2 seconds. There was no brawl. There was no chaotic struggle. It was a flawless clinical takedown. Richard hit the ground hard. The breath left his lungs in a sudden, violent rush. Before he could even understand what had happened, Blake dropped his knee squarely onto Richard's lower back, pinning him firmly to the floor. Blake kept Richard's right arm locked in a tight submission hold behind his back. He applied just enough upward pressure to ensure complete compliance without breaking the bone. "Do not move," Blake said. His voice was not loud. It was a quiet, absolute command. "If you struggle, this joint will snap. Nod if you understand me." Richard gasped for air, his face pressed against the cold concrete. He tried to thrash his legs, but Blake shifted his weight slightly, increasing the pressure on the shoulder joint. A sharp spike of pain shot through Richard's arm, forcing him to freeze completely. He squeezed his eyes shut and let out a pathetic whimper. He nodded his head frantically against the floor. Blake kept his breathing steady. His heart rate had barely elevated. He looked up from the subdued man and turned his attention back to the checkout counter. Shadow remained in his exact position, standing tall in front of Naomi. The dog had not moved a single muscle during the takedown. He trusted his handler entirely. "Naomi," Blake said, keeping his tone conversational. "Are you all right?" Naomi leaned over the counter. She stared at the scene unfolding on the floor with wide eyes. She had prepared herself to be struck by a heavy metal object just minutes ago. Now, the man who had threatened her job, insulted her race, and tried to physically assault her was pinned helplessly to the ground by a quiet stranger in hiking boots. She took a slow, deep breath, finally letting the tension drain from her shoulders. "I am okay. Thank you. Both of you." She looked at Blake, then at the magnificent K9 standing on her counter. "Good," Blake replied. He did not offer a grand speech. He simply did what was necessary. Underneath him, Richard began to whine. His anger was completely gone now, replaced by the sharp, undeniable reality of physical pain and total defeat. "Let me go," Richard pleaded, his voice muffled by the floor. "You are breaking my arm. You cannot do this to me. Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly what you are," Blake said coldly. "You are a coward who attacks people when you think they cannot fight back. You are going to stay exactly where you are until the police arrive." The wail of the sirens peaked, filling the entire store with a deafening noise. Red and blue lights began to flash rapidly through the front windows, casting erratic shadows across the walls of tactical gear. The cavalry had arrived. In the back of the store, a young man wearing a heavy warehouse jacket slowly stepped out from behind a stack of shipping pallets. He held a cell phone in his shaking hand. He had witnessed the entire altercation from the very beginning. When Richard had first raised the metal stove, the warehouse worker had dialed emergency services immediately. He had stayed on the line, whispering updates to the dispatcher. The heavy glass front doors slid open. 2 uniformed police officers rushed into the store, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They scanned the room quickly, assessing the situation. They saw a shattered phone on the floor, a cracked glass display case, a massive dog standing on a counter, and a man holding another man in a joint lock on the concrete. "Police!" the lead officer shouted, stepping forward. "Nobody move! Sir, release that man and step back slowly with your hands visible." Blake did not argue. He did not hesitate. He released the pressure on Richard's arm immediately, He stood up in one fluid motion, taking 3 deliberate steps backward. He raised both of his hands to shoulder height, keeping his palms open and visible. He maintained a calm, non-threatening posture, completely complying with the officer's commands. Richard stayed on the floor for a moment, clutching his shoulder and groaning loudly. He saw the police officers and immediately saw his chance for salvation. He scrambled to his knees, his face red and covered in dust. "Arrest him," Richard screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Blake. "Arrest him right now! He assaulted me! He tried to kill me with that dog! And arrest her too! She started all of this!" The lead officer frowned, looking from the hysterical man in the dirty suit to the calm, disciplined man standing quietly with his hands raised. The scene was chaotic, but the truth was about to surface. Officer Davis, a veteran cop with graying hair and a stern face, kept his hand near his radio. His younger partner, Officer Evans, moved to the side to secure the perimeter. Blake stood perfectly still by the climbing gear displays, his hands raised, projecting absolute calm. He knew exactly how to interact with law enforcement in a chaotic situation. Richard, however, saw the uniforms and immediately weaponized his status. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder. He brushed the dust off his expensive navy suit and pointed a shaking finger at Blake. "Arrest him!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing in the large store. "That man assaulted me! He threw me to the ground and tried to break my arm. He brought a vicious attack dog into this store and ordered it to kill me!" Officer Davis held up a hand. "Sir, calm down. Everyone stay exactly where they are. We are going to sort this out." "There is nothing to sort out," Richard interrupted, stepping toward the officers. "I am a high-tier customer. I spend thousands of dollars here. That woman," he pointed sharply at Naomi, "refused to do her job. She insulted me. Then she signaled this thug to attack me. You need to put them both in handcuffs right now." Officer Davis looked at Richard, taking in his flushed face and erratic movements. Then he looked at Blake. Blake had slowly lowered his hands and signaled shadow. The massive German shepherd moved to Blake's side and sat down immediately, completely silent and perfectly disciplined. Davis recognized the behavior instantly. That was not a wild attack dog. That was a highly trained working animal. "Sir," Blake said, addressing the officer with a calm, even tone. "My name is Blake. That man attempted to assault the store manager with a heavy metal object. I subdued him to prevent serious injury. I applied a standard control hold and released him the moment you arrived." Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh. "He is lying. Look at him. He is a violent lunatic. I was just trying to return a defective tent." Naomi walked around the shattered glass of the display case. She kept her posture straight and her voice clear. "Officer, my name is Naomi. I am the general manager of this location. The customer became irate when I denied his return due to user damage. He verbally abused me, used racial slurs, and then picked up that titanium stove right there." She pointed to the heavy metal cylinder resting on the floor. "He raised it over his head and was about to throw it at my face. This gentleman and his dog stepped in and stopped him. From the back aisle, the young warehouse worker stepped forward. He still held his phone. "She is telling the truth," the young man said nervously. "I saw the whole thing. I am the one who called emergency services. He was going to hit her with that metal stove." Richard spun around, glaring at the young employee. "You are all lying. You are covering for each other. I know people at the top of this company. I am going to have all of your jobs." Before the officers could begin separating the witnesses for official statements, the heavy front doors slid open again. A man walked in, stopping abruptly as he took in the flashing police lights outside and the chaotic scene inside. This was Greg Miller, the regional director of Altitude Tactical Supply. Greg was in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He had an authoritative presence, usually demanding strict order and perfect sales floors. He had simply stopped by for a routine, Unannounced inventory check. He certainly did not expect to walk into a crime scene. Richard saw Greg and his face lit up with immediate triumph. He believed his salvation had just walked through the door. "Greg," Richard yelled, waving his uninjured arm. "Thank God you are here. Look at what your people have done." Greg blinked, clearly confused by the shouting man. He recognized Richard vaguely from a few corporate charity dinners, but they were certainly not close friends. Richard marched toward Greg, acting as if they were brothers in arms. "Your manager here is completely incompetent, Greg. She treated me like garbage. Then she let some random street thug and his wild dog attack me. I am pressing charges. You need to fire her right this second. Tell these cops to arrest them." Greg Miller frowned deeply. He looked past Richard. He saw Naomi standing near the broken counter. He saw the police officers taking notes. Then his eyes moved to the tall man standing quietly next to the large German shepherd. The color instantly drained from Greg Miller's face. He dropped his leather briefcase. It hit the floor with a loud slap. Greg did not look at Richard. He completely ignored the wealthy man standing right in front of him, demanding justice. Greg's eyes were fixed entirely on Blake. A profound shift occurred in the regional director's demeanor. The strict corporate executive suddenly looked like a nervous junior employee caught making a mistake. He quickly adjusted his tie, smoothed his suit jacket, and walked forward. Richard smiled smugly, thinking Greg was marching over to fire Naomi and berate the stranger. "Exactly, Greg. Show them who is in charge." Greg walked right past Richard. He did not even acknowledge the man's presence. He walked straight toward Blake, his hands slightly raised in a gesture of absolute respect and unexpected panic. "Mr. Blake?" Greg said, his voice trembling slightly. He extended his right hand, dipping his head in a deep, formal nod. "I had no idea you were in Denver. Nobody informed the corporate office of your visit. Is everything all right here? Sir, please tell me you are not injured." The entire store went dead silent. The police officers stopped writing. Naomi raised her eyebrows in shock. Richard stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging open, unable to process what he was seeing. The regional director of the entire Western Division was practically bowing to the quiet stranger in the hiking boots. The silence in Altitude Tactical Supply felt dense, absolute, and punishing. Greg Miller stood with his arm extended toward Blake, his face completely pale under the bright track lights. Richard looked back and forth between the two men, his brain failing to compute the sudden shift in gravity. The man he thought was a nameless street criminal was being addressed with the highest level of corporate deference. "Mr. Blake," Greg repeated, his voice tight with anxiety. "But please tell me my staff did not cause this. If there has been any mistake on our end, I will rectify it immediately." Blake lowered his hands completely. He shook Greg's hand with a brief, firm grip. "The staff did exactly what they were supposed to do, Greg. Your manager, Naomi, handled a dangerous situation with perfect professionalism." Greg let out a long breath, visible relief washing over his tense features. He turned his head toward Naomi and gave her a sharp, respectful nod. "Thank you, Naomi. You will be compensated for this stress." Richard finally found his voice, though it came out high and cracked. "Greg, what are you doing? This man assaulted me. He threw me to the ground. Look at my suit. Look at my phone." He pointed wildly at the shattered glass and the debris on the floor. Greg Miller turned slowly to face Richard. The nervous humility vanished from Greg's face, replaced instantly by a cold corporate fury. "Shut up, Richard," Greg ordered flatly. Richard gasped, stepping back. "Excuse me? I am a top-tier client. I spend thousands here." "You are nothing," Greg said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "You are currently standing in front of the primary military consultant and tactical designer for this entire franchise, Mr. Blake developed the combat survival line that saved our corporate numbers last quarter. He holds the patents on 30% of the high-margin gear in this room. And more importantly, he is an active-duty Navy SEAL. Richard's eyes dilated. He looked at Blake's solid frame, the short military haircut, and the cold, unblinking hazel eyes. The reality of who he had just threatened hit him like a physical blow. He had tried to attack a specialized combat operator. Officer Davis stepped forward, his heavy boots clicking on the floor. He looked at Greg, then at Blake. "Mr. Miller, we have a statement from an employee stating this man." Davis pointed his pen at Richard, attempted to strike the manager with a heavy titanium stove. "We also have visual evidence of property damage." "Process it," Greg said without a second of hesitation. Altitude Tactical Supply is pressing full charges for assault, attempted battery, and property damage. Furthermore, Greg glared directly into Richard's pale face. "Your premium corporate membership is permanently revoked. You are banned from every location in North America. If you set foot near our properties again, you will be arrested for trespassing." Richard looked at the police officers. Officer Davis drew his steel handcuffs from his utility belt with a sharp, metallic click. "Hands behind your back, sir," Davis ordered. Richard did not fight. The arrogance had been completely drained from his body. He stood limply as Officer Evans grabbed his wrists and locked the cuffs into place. The ratcheting sound of the metal teeth echoed through the quiet store. They led him toward the glass exit doors, his head hanging low, his feet dragging against the concrete floor. The flashing red and blue lights outside illuminated his final humiliation as he was pushed into the back of the cruiser. The front doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of the police radio chatter. Greg Miller turned back to Blake. "Sir, I am incredibly sorry this happened during your leave." "It is handled," Blake said simply. He snapped his fingers once. Shadow stood up from his sitting position, his tail giving a single calm wag. Blake looked at Naomi. "You ran a tight line today, manager. Hold it." Naomi smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Blake." "Safe travels on your next deployment." Blake gave her a brief nod, turned on his heel, and walked toward the exit, with Shadow tracking perfectly at his left flank. The heavy glass doors slid open, and the fresh, crisp Colorado air swept into the building, clearing away the last remnants of the toxic confrontation. True power does not come from a bank account, a prestigious title, or the volume of your voice. It comes from the courage to stand your ground when someone tries to tear you down. Naomi showed us what real dignity looks like, refusing to let an arrogant man strip away her hard-earned authority. And Blake, along with his faithful canine Shadow, reminded us that true strength does not need to boast or intimidate. It simply acts when action is required. We must never stay silent when we see someone being mistreated. Bullies thrive in silence, but they crumble when good people step forward to protect the vulnerable. May God bless you with the same unshakable courage in your own life. May He surround you with protectors when you need them most and give you the strength to be a shield for others. If you believe that justice and kindness will always prevail over arrogance, please type Amen in the comments below. If this story inspired you, please share it with your friends and family to spread this powerful message. Leave a comment telling us what you would have done if you were in the store that day, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible and inspiring stories.